Welcome to the With Pride and Grit podcast, a show dedicated to helping you navigate a season of transition in your life. I'm your host, Jen Pasquale, and as a 16-year military spouse, I know firsthand how challenging life's transitions can be. I also know it's an opportunity for growth, discovery, and new beginnings. In this season of With Pride and Grit, we're sharing stories of military spouses who are or have successfully transitioned to civilian life. We'll also hear from experts who can offer valuable insights about transition resources available to support a spouse's journey. Whether you're just starting the transition process or already well on your way, this podcast is for you. We hope to provide you with the knowledge and inspiration to make the most of this new chapter in your life. Thanks for tuning in. Let's get started. Today, we're talking with Erin Lorenz as she shares a little about the transition experience for her family as they are on their way out the door leaving service. One of the things that I thought was really interesting about this conversation is we ended up talking quite a bit about the career side of transition, what that's like for the service member and what that is like for the spouse as they're trying to find their own path and their own way. And what are some things to think about in that process? So I hope you'll stick around and hear from Erin. So Erin, thank you for being willing to talk about this because I know it's not always easy for everyone to give us a glimpse into the inside of their family and what this transition process is like. So we really appreciate it.
Yeah, I'm glad to be able to share what I can and little things that I've learned. I feel like we're kind of right in the middle of the transition process. So I only know what I know.
Why don't you start us off at the beginning and tell us a little bit about your story and where you guys are in that process so folks understand where you're coming from with your thoughts and advice, and then we'll just kind of launch into a few questions.
Sure. Yeah. So we decided to officially retire a couple years ago, actually. It was right in the middle of the pandemic, and I'm trying to remember exactly what the catalyst was. We'd kind of gone back and forth. We have 4 children. There's the lure of staying in longer so that you get the higher retirement rank and grade and pay and all that stuff. But then also weighing that against our oldest is going to college this fall. And so do we want to continue to move around, pulling the younger 3 out consistently? And how do we manage that? Our parents are they're not getting any younger. They're healthy, but we just we're trying to reshift our focus back to, we've done the 20 years. My husband has put in and worked very hard and done all the deployments and done all the things, and we've got along with all of it. And the military has been really great to us in terms of just being able to see the world. We lived in Italy for 2 years, and all the people we've met and just the experiences we've had, I really wouldn't change any of that. But I just feel like we're ready to just be done, and be back in one spot near family and in an area that's familiar to us as well. And so that was kind of like the conversation we had over, I think, the first year of the pandemic, and then trickled in a little bit more. And then we finally were like, okay, yes, we're gonna. And that's when all the spreadsheets started. Or at least that's when I got to see them. I don't know when exactly they started, but that's when I got to see all of my husband's spreadsheets and just kind of planning out different things. And I don't know when he started all of his retirement classes and things. Like there's the TAPS and there's I think he reached out to a couple of other organizations. He had a mentor with ACP. And so definitely, I don't know that you asked this, but I think you're going to ask this. Those resources are super helpful. I even have a mentor with ACP. She's been great. We're actually winding down with you get them for a year and you meet once a month virtually, and they're in the field that you want to look at. Mine was a nonprofit because while I do work for Military No Stress PCS, there's not a lot of money in that. And I do it because it's my passion. It's close to my heart. And so I will continue to do it for as long as I'm able to, but I also want to expand my circle of work and career. And so my ACP mentor works with a nonprofit in California. And so over the last year, she and we meet, and my husband did a similar thing with who was more a corporate person. So they kind of run the gamut for that. And so he started doing that. And then I heard of 4Block, and they have an active duty component and a military spouse component. And so I did their purpose to launch. I think that's the right name for it. Sorry I think I might have, I don't know if I got that right or not.
I don't
And that
remember.
was, I did that this last fall. It started in September and went till December. So however many weeks that was, where you met once a week via Zoom with your group, and they have leaders, two very phenomenal leaders that work with you on your resume and your elevator pitches and all this stuff. And then they have another one day a week where they do another session that is optional. You can patch into that, or you can watch it via recording. And they have a platform that you can use to go and just do just a variety of different things in terms of your spouse career readiness. And so they really helped me get my LinkedIn up and tweaked my resume a little bit. And we talked about different career things that, and not really having done it. We volunteer and sometimes do odd jobs here and there, but really to look at what it is you want to do when you grow up. That's what I always say. I'm like, I don't know what I want to be when I grow up.
No.
Like a 40-year-old woman who says that, but
Uh-huh.
they were really instrumental in trying to help everyone in the group. I don't even remember how many, upwards of maybe 20 or so spouses were in the group from all over. We had a couple that were overseas even, and patching in at whatever time in the god awful morning it was for them, evening or whatever it was. So definitely looking into those different types of resources. And there's still several more out there that I heard of, but I just didn't. They do similar things to 4Block and ACP. So you just got to find the one that you think is going to help you the most, I guess, and go with that.
Well, and I think, the place from which everyone comes to transition is so varied. And so
Yes.
what some people need is more that career support and
Mm-hmm.
relaunch support, maybe even pivot support, because now, you can do anything theoretically. And
I
so
know.
figuring out what that anything is can be a little
Right.
daunting. And the ones you mentioned are great ones. Something I
Mm-hmm.
was thinking about in terms of the resources you've been able to utilize sound fantastic. And it sounds like those obviously are open to spouses, which is always something we like to highlight and focus on. Can
Mm-hmm.
you walk me back a little bit to the transition, like decision? So you mentioned, your husband probably had some like secret spreadsheet somewhere, and then out they come and say, this is the plan. And then you guys talk through that. But I would just love to know from like your perspective, what was that kind of experience like?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. I don't know if I was as ready then as I definitely am now, if that makes any sense. I've always been very much where when we retire, whenever that is, Minnesota is where we're going to go. Like that is my passion, my heart, my everything. Like I miss it very much. Not even just because my family's there, but that is a big part of it. And I'm fortunate enough to have connections with my family still, even 20 years later. And they've been very supportive when he's gone on deployment. And I've had 2-month-old twin babies and a second grader and a preschooler, and we moved in with them for that 18 months he was gone. And so they've been really supportive and great. And so for me, it's always been Minnesota. That's where we're going to go. And I'm really pretty flexible and I go with the flow. And at that point, I still was like that, we'd go back and forth, the two of us, on just the pros and cons of retiring at 20 versus
Mhm.
waiting. And then just with the pandemic, I think it just kind of shifted our focus just a little bit more on like family and just being near them with just everything that happened and
Sure.
going on. And we fortunately weren't really affected by that in terms of severe illness and whatnot, but you still saw it a lot.
Mhm.
And it just was one of those things I think just subconsciously just kind of made us like, you know what, we just need to be back in
Mhm.
Minnesota and be near family. And so that's kind of I think how it went. Again, I was mostly flexible. If we felt like it was the best for our family to stay in and do that extra whatever 3-4 years, then I would have probably been, yep, that's fine, let's do that. But also just being open to being done too, because
Mhm.
it's exhausting. So it's very rewarding, but it's also very exhausting.
Well, and I imagine too, with you've got 3 kids still in school, and so navigating
Yeah.
additional changes for them in the coming years, that's what I hear the most when folks talk about what are the big drivers for them putting a date on the calendar. you know,
Mhm.
the kids and their school and how many times they're going to have to move if we stay beyond this line or that line seems to
Right.
be one of the things that kind of floats to the top of that pros and cons list for just about everybody I've talked to that has school age
Mhm.
children.
Yeah, absolutely. And I look at mine, the younger ones, and so we moved here with our oldest one having 2 years left of high school. And he adapted. He left some good friends in Florida, and it was incredibly sad. He'd not really had that yet. But he understood that we were coming here and slid right in and found his group of people and got involved with the things. And looking at my other three, they also did that too. And I'm not really surprised by the younger two because they're young enough where like we had to switch schools for them in the middle of the pandemic just because of other things. And they just it was like they had been at that school the whole time. It was no big deal to them.
Right.
And but watching my now freshman, I really feel like we would be fine if we did have to stay if we stayed in the military and did a couple more moves. And he's just shown me his resiliency. I mean,
Mm.
it is really true what they say about military kids, at least just as a whole. They're just very resilient and they may not like it. And trust me, I don't always like it either. But they understand the importance of their parents serving and why they're doing it. And it's one of those you just do it because the bigger picture means more than what you're going through at that moment. And that's not always the case for everybody. I'm just saying that's for us,
Mhm.
that's what we have, I think, internally dealt with and come to the conclusion of we could do it again. And I think my kids would be fine. But it's all those other factors that I mentioned that we just want to kind of just be done and ready to move on to the next phase of our lives together.
So one of the things you mentioned, you guys already have a location, which for a lot of folks transitioning, location can be one of the really hard decisions, you know, next in
Right.
line behind what do the kids need? Sometimes it's where do we
Mhm.
want to be and what does that look like?
Yeah.
So I imagine for you guys that having known that for such a long time alleviated some of that stress that you had to go through. You still obviously have to find houses and like, you know, and do all the things, but to just know the where, have
Mhm.
you found that to really alleviate some stresses for you?
I mean, I think so. Like you said, we've known for a long time that was the place. And so if we hadn't known that, if I'd had some time where it was kind of like, where are we going to go? Maybe I could say more definitively that yes, that did take off some stress. But I mean, this is all I know, if for lack of a better way to say it. Like
Sure.
all I know is that we were always going to end up in Minnesota. So I imagine it did take some stress off, that some potential stress if we hadn't known. But yeah, I don't envy people that have to just maybe don't have that family connection or that connection to a specific place. But also, I feel like that's great too, because really the world's your oyster. Like
For
you want to
better or
buy
worse,
that villa in Italy for $1,000 and move there?
right?
Sure, go for it. I
Sure, no
mean, I don't
problem.
know. California is like your place and you're not from there, or I don't know. I mean, obviously that's a lot easier said than done, but there's something to that freeness, I think, as
Mhm.
well for people to just kind of like throw a dart and that's where you ended up in Paluca, Oklahoma or something.
Right. I think it's very much like the grass is always greener. If you have a set place, you're like, "Oh, it'd be so cool to not have a place." And if you don't have a place, you're like, "Man, I wish I had a place to go."
With anything, there's pros and cons.
For
It's
sure.
yeah,
For sure.
yeah.
I would if you'd be willing, I would love for you to walk us through a little bit of what the as you think about the transition, you've talked a little bit about the kind of the career shift and what you're looking at
Mhm.
doing or what that may look like for you. How has that experience been wrapping that into this transition? Has that given you some focus of what to do sort of on the other side, or has it made it more stressful? Just I'm just curious how that professional side of things for the spouse comes into play in the transition.
Yes. So for me, the transition resources that I've used in the last year have really helped me focus on not focus, but pinpoint what I want to do getting back to Minnesota and really working in more like a social service setting, which isn't really, I mean, I've done a little bit of that in the last 20 years and some volunteer gigs and then some working paid gigs as well. And so to be able to take some of that and transition it to this other side has been really interesting to see, especially in the prepare to launch class. They talked about how you can translate your volunteer services, and even being a military spouse, like what characteristics have you developed as a spouse because of moving all the time that you can translate into your resume and into your elevator pitch. And so it's really helped me just kind of focus, or put everything into a different focus versus just having him retire, and then we end up in Minnesota, and then I'm like, now what do I do? And that's still not to say that I'm set, because I'm certainly not. Looking just at jobs and things like that to just kind of start applying to, just because the job market is also crazy. If applying to things and not putting all your eggs in one basket, sort of, just trying to see what different options there are out there. I think I kind of answered your question.
What I hear in that I think is important is this idea that, to the extent possible, do some of your things early if you can.
Oh, yes.
And
yes.
sometimes circumstances don't allow for that, but it sounds like
Sure.
you've been able to really invest in your own journey in a way that's going to help you just hit the ground running when you get to the other side and get to that final location. Whereas if you were waiting until then you're both in the same season doing the same thing at the same time. And that can certainly be a lot to shoulder. So I love that you've kind of taken those opportunities and latched onto them and used them to help shape. You don't have to have it all figured out, but it just helps give you a little bit of a funnel, right? It helps shape things a little bit for you so that you don't spend that precious time on the other side in this new life, trying to figure out, okay, now what do I want to do? You've already answered some of those questions, which I think is really important.
Right. And for me, that question was a big question mark, but it seemed like it was a bigger question mark for my husband, because how do you translate the military service into a civilian career? And so knowing that he was dealing with that really as a bigger question, because he's been the primary breadwinner, and that's been a choice that we made intentionally to do that together. But then for me to be able, I think he said at one point, he's like, I'm not worried about you getting a job. Like, you've gotten, your resume stands by itself, even though it's been a year here, 2 years there. He's like, your resume will get you something. And so for me, it was really about focusing on what do I want to do, and then being able to do that so that he can focus on his area. And really, he's been working on his stuff a lot longer than I have, in terms of just trying to figure out what he did in the military translate. And then if he had started applying, I think, to jobs back in December, just to get his feet wet and all that stuff. And some people, I think I don't know how many applied to, but a lot of them didn't, never reached out. And that is a big ego hit, right? Because he does, I'm a little biased, but he does a fantastic job at what he does now in the military. And so just getting the civilian people to recognize that is, I think, a challenge for him. And so for me, though, because a lot of my work is civilianist, it's like civilian stuff, that's easier to go to another civilian organization and say, this is what my stuff translates to, because it's pretty black and white, versus his stuff is a little bit harder sometimes to say, I did this, so how does that line up with this job description? And how can I make those two connect in a way that makes the employer want to say, hey, let's interview that person.
Right.
And then also for us too, having a backup plan in case some of the jobs didn't pan out, because like I said, he didn't get responses for a lot of the jobs that he applied to for whatever reason. And so we had, I think it was even up to last month, we were still working on a backup plan, where it was really, he was gonna just stop looking at jobs for now, focus on getting our pack out scheduled and getting the kids through school, and our oldest graduates in a couple of weeks, and doing all of those things, getting us moved to Minnesota. And then, we would regroup once we landed there if he didn't have a job. And fortunately, he was able to secure something. So that piece is mostly less stressful right now. There's still some stress pieces to it, of course, because it's a new job in the civilian world, and there's a lot of unknowns right now that he'll figure out. There was a lot of unknowns when he joined the military, and we figured it out.
Yeah.
It's just being flexible, but also having a backup plan to your original plans, and then maybe even having a backup plan to that backup plan. And
We're good at A, B, and C in this life. So
exactly.
D, E, and F, anyone? What I was thinking as you were talking is what is the two sides of knowing where you're going can alleviate stress. And then it can add stress because now you have to find a job in this location. So I think it just sort of goes to show that every decision you make is going to have some things that's going to make easier and probably some things that's going to make harder. Because I think that's just the nature of this whole thing.
Yeah.
Because otherwise it's just, there's so many decisions. And I think that's what I hear folks talk a lot about is just the number of decisions that they have to make during the process. I would love if you would be willing to kind of walk us through that, which is, if looking back now, almost being on the other side of this, what's the top one or two things you really wish, in spite of being pretty well informed, like, what do you wish you had known when he first pulled those spreadsheets out?
Oh my gosh, I don't know. That's a good question. Really just going back to him applying to jobs and them not even reaching back out, because again, like, his resume is very impressive. And again, I'm a little biased, but it's just, I don't understand why these people aren't at least reaching out. And I think that's just the job market for, whatever reason. I think we should develop a rule or a law that says if somebody applies to something and you're not going to interview them, you need to let them know. So then they're not just like hanging, waiting. Obviously, after a certain amount of time, it's pretty obvious, but still, I think it's very rude to not tell people that we're just going to pass, and maybe tell them why, so then they can reshift that, or, maybe not apply to those kinds of jobs because that maybe would be a barrier.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's a good question.
Well, and I think that, the what I heard you say when you were talking about that before is you really both went through the same thing, right? His challenge was translating his military experience into civilian speak. Your challenge, if I heard it, was not so much you had civilian skill sets, but then you had these sort of gaps that military spouses have. And so more it's
Right.
kind of explaining the gap, or sort of translating the gap, or translating volunteer work into something marketable as a resume skill. And so in some ways it's like you guys both navigated the same thing from just two different vantage points.
A bit, yeah.
Which can definitely be hard and unexpected sometimes when we think I feel like I'm marketable. Like, why is this so hard?
I know. I was just saying that to him the other day because I'd applied just for, again, to get my feet wet to a couple of different positions. And then I hadn't heard anything back. And so we were just talking about that. And I was like, he said, the jobs that I've had personally over the last couple of years have been as a result of the networking piece. Like, I knew someone and they were like, you should do this, you should apply to this. And that's true. That is very true. And I get that piece, but I'm also like, why does my resume not, like, and he said it does, and I believe that it does, but at the same time, I need to get the employers to believe that it stands by itself. Like, why is that not enough for you to just call me and have a phone interview? I don't understand, because my resume is stellar. I'm just saying.
And I think it goes back to, it sounds like it's really the same thread, right? And it's actually, the thread is civilian education, right? It's civilian understanding of what these skill sets mean. It's civilian understanding of what a spouse's gaps actually mean. And that they're not an indicator of lack of loyalty or of motivation or drive or any of those things.
Absolutely.
That they're just a product of a PCS that we had no control over. So what I hear is really like, that's what we need, that's our next project. And there's a lot of folks in the space, I think, trying to work to educate the civilian, workplace on what's the value of a veteran coming into your organization? What's the value of a military spouse coming in? Because we are a tenacious bunch and we can get things done. So you might want us around.
Exactly. Yeah.
No, I look forward to following you and hearing where you land, because I have no doubt you're going to find a great place to continue to do good work.
Yeah.
Is there any other kind of closing thoughts you have about the transition process you guys have been through, or just advice you'd give someone who's just on the edge of that process?
I would just really just, start planning. It's not too early to start just thinking about these things. And I give my husband a bad time because of the spreadsheets, but I really, he's put a lot of work into those and has ultimately set himself up for a good job once we're officially out. And I just feel like that is key, is planning, and it's not just, and I'm not saying people do this, but maybe they do, just like being done and then just thinking that it's just going to automatically happen, because, and in some cases it probably does, but the things I've seen in my own experience and just being a part of the different spouse groups that are strictly like for the transitioning and retiring groups, there's a lot of people out there talking about the job market and how their spouse isn't getting callbacks or it's just difficult. And so, I mean, maybe no amount of planning will help that, but I just feel like, over planning, is that a thing for this type of process? I don't think so. I think you're going to cover all your bases that way, and you're going to be really familiar with what you can offer to people and be able to put that out there in a way that hopefully brings employers back to you and says yes. And I also think too, again, like I said earlier, I'm a super laid back person and I tend to go with the flow. And I think that's really important too, because there are a lot of unknowns. And if I got hung up on every single thing that I didn't know or didn't have the answer to, I would go stark raving mad. And so it's just recognizing that a lot of these are unknowns and they'll be known eventually. And just having that patience to be able to get to that point where it's an unknown, and then now it's a known. And then you'll have other things that are unknown.
No, for sure.
That's just the way life works.
So I know it doesn't end with transition.
No, it doesn't. Unfortunately, you just get different unknowns.
For sure. Well, I really appreciate you being willing to share a little bit about what your journeys look like, and hopefully someone will hear something that makes them go, oh yeah, I should go check out that resource, or I should get us started on some spreadsheets. So we are definitely a spreadsheet family over here too. So I have a lot of love for that. I think it's a great way to go.
It is, definitely.
Yeah. Thank you for spending some time with us.
Yeah, no, thank you again for having me on. I appreciate it. It's been fun.
That's it for today. Thank you so much for joining us for another episode of the With Pride and Grit podcast. We're so grateful to our guests for sharing their stories and expertise with us, and we're grateful to you, our listeners, for tuning in. Please remember to subscribe to the podcast so you don't miss any future episodes. And we always appreciate you sharing us with a friend or leaving a kind review. If you have any questions or suggestions for future episodes, please don't hesitate to reach out to us. You can find us on social media under @PrideandGrit or on our website, prideandgrit.com. Until next time, please remember you're not alone on this journey, and it is our privilege to walk alongside you.